Welcome back to the deep dive, especially to all our listeners getting ready for the UPSC GS1 Modern History syllabus. We know you're working hard. And of course, to anyone who just loves history and wants to understand India better, you're in the right place. Last time, we talked about how the British got involved in India. This time, we're diving into a big question. How did the British end up conquering India? It wasn't just Indian rulers they had to deal with. There were other European powers, too. It's complicated. Luckily, we have our expert historian back with us to help us understand it all.
It's a fascinating period of history, and yeah, it's way more complicated than a simple conquest story.
Okay, so our sources show there was a lot of competition in India back then. It wasn't just the British. All the major European powers, Portugal, France, the Dutch, they all wanted a piece of India. So how did Britain win? What was their advantage?
The British East India Company was a big part of it. It wasn't like other European trading companies. It was more like almost a mini empire itself. They had their own army, made treaties, even their own money.
So it was like a company acting like a government.
Exactly. That gave them a lot of freedom and power, way more than their competitors.
I can see how that would give them a head start.
Yeah, they could react quickly to things without waiting for orders from Europe.
The sources also mentioned that Britain had a really strong navy. Back then, sea routes were super important.
Yeah, absolutely. Naval power meant controlling trade, moving troops, and stopping your rivals.
Whoever ruled the sea basically controlled everything.
Pretty much. It's almost like controlling the internet today.
Whoever controls information has so much power.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about something a little less fun. One of the sources talks about divide and rule, something the British were known for. How did that work in India?
Divide and rule, sadly, is a common tactic throughout history. Empires use it to weaken the people they want to conquer. In India, the British were really good at playing different rulers and kingdoms against each other.
So instead of facing a united India, they could fight them one by one, right?
Exactly. They'd make alliances with one kingdom against another, then switch sides or withdraw support. It kept everyone off balance and stopped any real resistance from forming.
Sounds so calculated.
Oh, it was. A good example is how they used the rivalry between the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad.
They kept them fighting each other so neither could get strong enough to challenge them.
Exactly.
It's sad, but also makes you think, how many conflicts today are because of similar tactics?
You've hit on a really important point. Understanding history can help us see how power works, even today. It's not just about armies. It's about manipulation and playing the long game.
Okay, so we've got the strong navy, divide and rule. The sources also mention alliances and diplomacy. But wasn't it all about military power in the end? How did diplomacy fit into their strategy?
Military power was definitely important, but the British knew that wouldn't be enough to control India long term. They had to build alliances and play the long game.
So they actually negotiated with Indian rulers.
They did. Sometimes they offered protection against rivals, other times they appealed to a ruler's ambitions. Their approach depended on the situation and the people involved.
That sounds complicated.
It was. One interesting example is their alliance with the Maharaja of Jaipur in the 18th century.
Tell me more about that. What kind of alliance was it?
It had a few layers. The British gave the Maharaja military help in his conflicts. In return, they got trading advantages and the Maharaja's support in future campaigns.
It sounds like they were becoming a key part of Indian politics while also getting what they wanted.
That's exactly right. They recognized that India's political landscape was complex, and they adapted to it.
Okay, next up, technology. The sources talk about the railways and the telegraph as major factors in British success.
Back then, those were cutting-edge technologies like the internet or even space travel today.
Yeah, I can see that. Imagine being able to talk across huge distances instantly or move troops so fast.
That's what the telegraph and railways allowed them to do. They could respond to problems quickly, coordinate their armies, and control information. Indian rulers just couldn't keep up.
So the British were way ahead technologically.
They were.
But wasn't all that progress built on exploiting the Indian people? The sources mention administrative efficiency, but wasn't that just a nice way of saying exploitation?
It's a good point. British rule was absolutely exploitative, but we also have to acknowledge that they were good at administration. They organized taxes, set up a legal system, and even had some meritocracy in their government jobs.
So even though their motives were selfish, they did bring some order to things.
Yes, and that order, even though it was imposed, helped them stay in power.
It's complicated, right?
It is.
Okay, so we've got the Navy, divide and rule, alliances, technology. The sources also mention specific individuals like Robert Clive and Warren Hastings. Did individual leaders really make a difference in all of this?
That's where things get really interesting. While systems and strategies were crucial, individual choices and personalities absolutely shaped what happened, like Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. That was a huge turning point. Clive's leadership and his willingness to take risks really made a difference.
Oh, I remember reading about that. A smaller British force defeated a much larger Indian army. It's amazing. How did they manage that?
It was a mix of things. Military tactics, smart alliances, and understanding the weaknesses of the other side. Clive used all of that to turn what seemed like a sure defeat into a major win.
Wow. It shows how one leader can change everything. But our sources also talk about something else that's often forgotten. The British had a lot of money.
Yes, money was very important back then, just like today. The British East India Company had tons of cash from their trade all over the world. They could afford wars, build new things, even influence political decisions. Having that kind of money gave them a huge advantage over many Indian rulers.
It's like having an endless supply of money while your opponents are struggling to get by.
Exactly. Imagine an Indian ruler facing a tough situation, maybe a bad harvest or internal conflicts. Suddenly, it's much harder to resist the British. But the British, with all their wealth, could handle those problems much easier.
That makes sense. Our sources also point out something that seems kind of contradictory. The British told everyone they were superior, but at the same time, they also tried to adapt to local conditions. How did they do both?
It shows how flexible they were. Spreading the idea of European superiority helped them justify what they were doing. But they also knew that if they alienated the Indian people completely, it would backfire.
So they had to find a balance.
Exactly. They made some concessions, incorporated some local customs, and even gave some government jobs to Indians.
But it was still a very unequal system. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But these strategies did help them take control more smoothly and reduced resistance.
It's a classic carrot and stick approach.
You got it. But it's worth noting that this strategy didn't always work. There were many uprisings against British rule.
That's true. Okay, so we've talked about naval power, divide and rule, alliances, technology, and we've seen how individual leaders and money played a role too. It's starting to seem like the British had everything going for them.
They did have a lot of advantages, but we can't forget that Indian rulers weren't just sitting back and letting it happen. Our sources talk about figures like Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan who fought hard against the British.
Yes, those who resisted deserve to be remembered. Why do you think those resistance movements ultimately couldn't defeat the British?
There were a few reasons. One big problem was a lack of unity among the Indian rulers. The British were really good at exploiting those divisions. They kept the Indian rulers from forming a strong, united front.
So even though leaders like Tipu Sultan were brave and resourceful, they couldn't overcome that division.
Right. Tipu Sultan was a skilled military leader and even adopted new technologies early on, but he still couldn't match the British in resources and alliances.
I did read that Tipu Sultan was ahead of his time when it came to technology.
He was fascinated by European military technology. He tried to use it in his own army. He even set up factories to make cannons and rockets based on European designs. He knew that to challenge the British, he needed to match their technology.
It sounds like he was trying hard to level the playing field.
He was, but he faced challenges. He didn't have the industrial base or skilled engineers the British had. And even more importantly, he didn't have the huge global trade network that funded the British military.
So even with new technology, he couldn't close the gap in resources.
Unfortunately, no. It's a good reminder that technology alone isn't enough. You also need economic strength, political stability, and skilled people.
Tipu Sultan's story is inspiring, but it also shows how hard it was to fight such a powerful and wealthy adversary.
It does. And it reminds us that history is more than just dates and names. It's about understanding all the different factors that shape events. The choices people made, the role of technology, the power of money, and how important it is to be united against a common enemy.
It's all connected.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this part of our discussion, what are some key takeaways about the British conquest of India?
It wasn't a simple or inevitable event. It happened because of a lot of different factors working together, like superior naval power, strategic alliances, technological advances, and effective administration.
And we can't forget about the impact of individual leaders like Robert Clive.
Absolutely. We also need to remember those who resisted British rule, like Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. Even though they were ultimately defeated, their stories remind us that history isn't just about the winners. it's also about those who fought for their freedom.
It's a good reminder that even against incredible odds, people can make a difference. Their courage is worth remembering.
Yes, it is. And finally, studying history is about more than just facts and figures. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world and learning from both the good and bad things that happened in the past.
By learning how the British conquered India, we can understand things like power dynamics, the role of technology in conflict, and the importance of unity and strategy. These are lessons that apply not only to history exams, but also to understanding the world we live in today.
Exactly. And maybe even more importantly, it helps us appreciate the fight for freedom and justice that continues to this day.
That's a powerful thought. But there's more to the story, right? We still need to understand the long-term effects of British rule in India, both the good and the bad. That's a whole other deep dive.
I'm looking forward to it. It's a topic that's fascinating and crucial to understanding India's journey to independence and its place in the modern world.
So before we finish up, is there anything else our listeners should think about as they learn more about history?
One thing to remember is that we often focus on the big events, the empires, the famous people, but it's the smaller choices, the things individuals decide to do that can really change things.
So it's not just about the big, important people and their plans. It's also about the everyday decisions that everyone makes.
Exactly. And that's actually pretty cool. It means we all have a role to play in how things turn out. By understanding the patterns of the past, the consequences of certain choices, we can make better decisions today and maybe even influence what happens in the future.
So it's not just about learning from the past, it's about using that knowledge now.
Absolutely. Whether you're studying for the UPSC, trying to figure out something tough at work, or even just making a personal decision, understanding how seemingly small choices can have big results is incredibly valuable.
It's like having a special ability to see how choices played out in the past and use that knowledge to make better choices today.
Exactly. And it's not just about conquering or winning, it's about any big change, whether it's social, political, or even technological.
So next time I have a big decision to make, I should think like a historian. Ask myself, what if this goes wrong? What if I don't have enough resources? What could happen that I'm not expecting?
I think that's a great idea. By thinking through the possible outcomes of different choices and considering how things have happened in the past, you can make more informed and strategic decisions.
I like that. Okay, before we wrap up our deep dive into the British and India, is there one main takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is to understand that history isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices people make, both the powerful and the everyday people. By studying those choices and the forces that were at work, we can understand the past better and appreciate the power we all have to shape the future.
That's a great point. So, to our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep connecting the past to the present and the future. And if you're studying for the UPSC, remember, understanding why things happened is just as important as knowing what happened. Until next time, happy learning. Don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into fascinating historical topics. Share it with your friends too, especially those interested in India's journey through the modern era. We'll be back soon with another deep dive. We can't wait to explore more with you.